They decided who he was before he reached the ceremony doors, before the music began, before the bride ever appeared. A black man in a plain, unremarkable suit stood near the entrance of a luxury wedding venue where silk gowns brushed marble floors and wealth spoke without words. In seconds, eyes measured him, whispers followed, and conclusions were drawn with careless confidence. Someone assumed he was staff. Someone else quietly laughed. A phone lifted, ready to record a moment of embarrassment they felt certain was coming. He didn't argue or explain. He didn't ask for permission to exist in that space. He simply stood there, calm, carrying the kind of silence that comes from surviving worse than judgment. What none of them knew, not the guests, not the family, not even the man blocking his way, was that the groom had been waiting for him. And when the groom finally saw him and spoke, 5 quiet words would collapse every assumption in the room. My boss just arrived. Weddings reveal more than love. They expose power, status, and the invisible rules about who belongs where. This wedding was no exception. The venue radiated old money elegance, crystal chandeliers, polished floors, and a guest list that looked carefully selected rather than invited. Everyone moved with confidence, dressed in certainty, except for one man who didn't seem to perform well the way the room expected. His suit was simple, his presence unannounced, and that alone made people uneasy. Guests glanced at him the way people do when something doesn't fit the picture they already have in their minds. No one asked his name or why he was there. They didn't need to, or so they believed. In their world, belonging was obvious, and he didn't match the image. But he stood quietly, unbothered, absorbing the stares and the silent rejection with practiced composure. He wasn't lost. He wasn't mistaken. He was waiting. Because some truths don't arrive loudly or demand attention. Some truths walk in quietly, allow the world to reveal itself, and then change everything without ever raising their voice. The judgment didn't announce itself loudly. It moved through the room in practiced glances and polite smiles that never reached the eyes. As the man stood near the entrance, conversations bent around him, careful and dismissive, like he was an obstacle rather than a guest. A member of the wedding staff hesitated before approaching him, not to welcome him, but to redirect him, asking softly if he was looking for the service area. Nearby, a group of guests paused their laughter just long enough to stare, then resumed with a tone that felt thinner than before. He noticed all of it, the way people notice storms before rain, because he had spent his entire life learning how to read rooms that didn't expect him to be in them. He had learned early that America often decided who you were before you ever opened your mouth, especially when you didn't wear your success in obvious ways. Years ago, growing up in a neighborhood where ambition had to be quiet to survive, he learned discipline instead of performance, patience instead of pride. His mother used to say that the loudest people were usually the most afraid of being seen clearly, and that lesson stayed with him as he stood there now, refusing to shrink or overcompensate. Security eventually approached, polite but firm, asking him to step aside because there had been some confusion. No one asked for his name. No one asked for an invitation. The assumption was enough. Across the room, the groom's family moved comfortably, greeting guests and exchanging congratulations, unaware that a familiar pattern was unfolding just beyond their circle. A young girl nearby tugged on her mother's hand and asked why the man wasn't allowed to go inside like everyone else, and her mother hushed her quickly, embarrassed not by the situation, but by the question itself. He caught the child's eye and offered a small, reassuring smile, one that carried understanding rather than bitterness. Children still saw the world before it learned how to edit itself. As the minutes passed, the atmosphere tightened. Whispers grew sharper. Someone joked that he must have wandered in from the wrong event. Someone else suggested calling the groom's father to handle it. Phones hovered again, sensing drama, because America loved a spectacle as long as it didn't require self-reflection. Through it all he remained steady, grounded in the same composure that had carried him through classrooms where he was underestimated, boardrooms where he was questioned twice as hard, and negotiations where people assumed he was the assistant until the numbers spoke for him. He had learned that dignity was a kind of armor, one that didn't shine but never cracked. The groom finally noticed the disruption as he stepped away from a group of relatives. His expression shifted, not with confusion, but recognition. He crossed the room without hesitation, weaving past guests who suddenly fell silent, unsure why the energy had changed. When he reached the man by the entrance, he didn't lower his voice or pull him aside. He smiled, genuine and unguarded, and placed a hand on his shoulder as if anchoring something that had always belonged there. "You made it," the groom said warmly, then turned toward the room, his voice carrying easily across the space. "I was wondering when my boss would arrive." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was seismic. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Smiles froze. A woman near the bar lowered her glass slowly as the words registered. Someone near the aisle whispered, "Did he just say boss?" The staff member who had asked him to step aside stiffened, color draining from his face. The groom continued, unaware or uninterested in cushioning the impact. He explained, plainly and without embellishment, that this man had mentored him, promoted him, and trusted him when others had not. That his career, his confidence, and much of his success had been shaped by the person everyone had been so quick to dismiss. The hierarchy the room relied on cracked in real time. Guests recalculated their earlier assumptions, replaying their own glances and whispers with growing discomfort. The groom's father stood rigid, realization settling heavily in his posture as he understood that the man he had silently judged now held influence far beyond his own social standing. The man at the center of it all didn't gloat or explain. He didn't correct anyone. He simply nodded once, calmly, as if the truth had finally caught up to the room on its own schedule. That was the part that unsettled them most. He hadn't needed the moment. The moment needed him. As the reception resumed, the energy shifted. People approached him differently now, carefully, respectfully, some apologetic, others overly friendly, trying to rewrite the narrative they had already revealed. He accepted their words with politeness, but without warmth, understanding that accountability mattered more than comfort. Across the room, the groom watched quietly, proud not just of the man who had helped shape his future, but of the lesson unfolding around them. In a single evening, without confrontation or anger, the wedding had exposed something deeper about power in America, how often it was mistaken for appearance, and how rarely people questioned the rules they inherited. And standing there, unchanged and unbothered, the man everyone had judged understood something they were only beginning to learn. True authority doesn't demand recognition. It waits, and when it finally speaks, it leaves no room for doubt. The wedding ended the way most do, with music, laughter, and carefully posed photographs. But something far more important had shifted beneath the surface. People left the venue replaying their own behavior, not because they were told to, but because they had seen themselves clearly for the first time. The man they had dismissed walked out exactly as he had walked in, calm, unbothered, carrying nothing but his dignity, while the room around him struggled to recover from the truth it had exposed. He hadn't raised his voice, demanded respect, or asked to be understood. He had simply existed without apology, and that was enough to force a reckoning. For the groom, the moment reaffirmed a lesson he had learned long ago, that leadership isn't about titles or appearances, but about character and consistency. For everyone else, the night left behind an uncomfortable, but necessary reminder of how easily assumptions replace understanding. In America, where success is often judged by symbols rather than substance, this story asks a simple question: how many times have we decided someone's worth before learning their name? The answer lingers long after the music fades, urging us to choose curiosity over judgment, humility over hierarchy, and humanity over habit, because the next person we overlook might be the one teaching us who we really are.